From the moment the horse is born to the time he grows to be a powerful thoroughbred racehorse, every owner dreams of the day when the horse will come thundering down the stretch to win it all, to be the champion. The Governor General's Trophy, awarded annually to the winner of the Canadian Derby, the best three-year-old in the country. The Canadian Derby actually began in 1930. In Western Canada, recognized racing began in Winnipeg in 1924. And it was soon after that that racetracks began in a number of prairie cities, including Saskatoon, Regina, Calgary, and Edmonton, forming the Prairie Circuit. Attendance surged upward the first few years, and it soon became obvious to everyone involved that some form of stimulus was necessary to the prairie breeding industry, and thus the creation of the Canadian Derby. The announcement was made in 1929, announcing that the first Derby would be staged at Winnipeg's Polo Park, with a purse money of $2,000 added. For the first Derby in 1930, a total of 45 colts and fillies were nominated, representing virtually every thoroughbred that was pulled in the three prairie provinces. The winner in 1930 was Jack Whittier. From that far-off day when Jack Whittier became the first Derby winner to the present, when victory means nationwide acclaim for the horse, the owner, and the jockey, the Canadian Derby has continued to grow in stature. No longer is the event just another horse race, but it's an institution that continues to bring fame to Edmonton and to northern Alberta, and enjoyment to the thousands of fans who annually crowd into Northlands Park for the thrills, the pageantry, the excitement exclusively reserved for the Canadian Derby. Northlands manager Morris Taylor has seen all the Canadian Derbies that have been staged at Northlands Park in Edmonton. He reflects back on how, why, and when the Canadian Derby came to Northlands.
The Canadian Derby was the brainchild of a man named R. James Spears, who is considered to be the founder of thoroughbred racing on the prairie provinces of Canada. He owned Polo Park, the old racetrack in Winnipeg, and starting in 1925, recognized racing began in that city as well as in Saskatchewan and Alberta. In 1930, Mr. Spears realized that in order to improve breeding in the provinces, he must have major stake races. And for this reason, he created the Canadian Derby with a purse of $2,000, which at the time was a very major race, even considering some of the purse values in the province of Ontario. It was raced at Polo Park in Winnipeg from 1930 until the track was demolished in 1956. In 1957, Edmonton Exhibition Association offered to take the Canadian Derby, to increase the purse to $10,000 added, and to host the race here in the capital of Alberta. Since that date, in 1957, the race has been held at Northlands. In 1957, appropriately enough, the first Alberta running of the Canadian Derby was won by Spangle Jimmy, owned by Jimmy Charlesworth and bred by Mr. Charlesworth just on the outskirts of Edmonton. The next year, in 1958, Percy Yates, Calgary-owned three-year-old, won the Derby in a thrilling neck finish. And in 1959, the first filly to win an Edmonton Derby, Sonoma, carrying the silks of Mr. Lee Williams of Edmonton, won over a muddy racetrack. In 1960, it was Count Latham, again an Alberta bred, owned by the Marsh family of Calgary, who won a popular victory. 1961 proved to be a very benchmark year for the Canadian Derby, and for that matter, for many of the major stake races in North America. Prior to 1961, there was a belief in thoroughbred racing that no stake race could ever be limited to the number of starters. In other words, no matter how many horses entered, that was the number that were permitted to start. In 1961, a total of 19 horses were nominated and entered in the Canadian Derby of that year. forcing Northlands to offer the Derby in 2 divisions, an action which everyone believed damaged the status of the race itself. So following that year, Northlands became the first track in North America to institute a series of rules which guaranteed the Derby to run first in 1 division, secondly with the best possible horses available. The 2 divisions that year were won by General C and Galindo, both Vancouver invaders for the Derby. The following year, in 1962, it was an appropriate year for the Canadian Derby and for people who were responsible for its success. Back in 1958, Edmontonian Walter Sprague became chairman of the newly formed Canadian Derby Committee of the Edmonton Exhibition Association. Under Mr. Sprague's guidance, all of the ideas that have become commonly known to Derby Day in Edmonton and copied throughout North America for races like the Queen's Plate and BC Derby won the Canadian Derby that year. Western Morn, co-owned by Walter Sprague of Edmonton and Cease Ross, charged up to win his first race of 1962 and certainly his most important race of his life, the Canadian Derby. In 1963, for the first time in Derby history, a winner of the prestigious Manitoba Derby won the Canadian Derby that year. Brother Leo, certainly the favorite of the local fans, owned by W.H. Spud Murphy of Calgary, won the race over the hotly favored Kai Miracle, Jack Diamond's entry from Vancouver. 1964, a horse called Quick Quick came over the mountains from Vancouver with a reputation of never having been headed out of the gate and having won most of the major sweepstakes in the BC that year. Certainly living up to his reputation, he sprinted into a clear lead away from the gate, but turning for home brought the crowd to their feet. When 6 lengths in front, he bolted right to the outside fence at Northlands. The jockey quickly swung him back, and thanks to his commanding lead, he managed to hang on to win that year. 1965 was, to many people, the dream Derby of all time. It brought together a local favorite, Chariot Chaser, a small filly owned and bred by Lloyd Wilson of Edmonton, meeting head-on with Weedbender, the stallion from Vancouver with a long series of impressive stake victories. As the race began over a sloppy racetrack, Weedbender jumped into a commanding 15-length lead, while Chariot Chaser under Sandy Shields trailed far back, in fact 28 lengths back of Weedbender. As the field turned into the backstretch for the final time, Chariot Chaser began her move, Weedbender still leading by a long margin. Into the stretch, Chariot Chaser had narrowed the margin to 4 lengths. And down the stretch, to the cheers of the largest crowd ever to attend a Canadian Derby, Chariot Chaser won by a neck.
What a finish. This is going to be a 2-horse race. It is Weedbender on top. Chariot Chaser moving on strong and closing the gap. Here they come, out of the turn and into the home stretch. Salty Sultan is way back in 3rd. And look at them drive coming home. It is Weedbender on top. No, here it comes, Chariot Chaser, a close finish. Chariot Chaser and Weedbender. And this is definitely going to be a photo finish. And Salty Sultan, by the way, finished 3rd.
1966, Klondike Prince, not favored, in fact a long shot in the Canadian Derby, was rated just back of this early pace during the first mile of the 1 3/8 Classic. Turning for home, Klondike Prince pulled away to a commanding 3-length lead and then lasted in a thrilling drive to defeat Straight In. The winning payoff that day, $28.10 on Jack Schechter's Klondike Prince. 1967, the 100th birthday of Canada, was one of the appropriate years for Alberta's leading breeder. Max Bell of Calgary, owner of Golden West Farms, had had great success all over the world of racing. He'd won the English Derby. He'd won the Queen's Plate in Toronto, and many of America's major stake races, never the Canadian Derby. 1967 proved to be his year. With only 8 horses facing the starter, Gilmore, ridden by Jerry Rasmussen, charged up in a blanket finish to win the 1967 Canadian Derby. 1968 saw one of those rare events in a race the distance of the Canadian Derby, a head-to-head duel over the entire 1 3/8 miles distance. Irish Minstrel and Sun Costume, representing East and West, ran head-and-head to the mid-stretch when Sun Costume, the Eastern invader, pulled away. 1968 represented another milestone in the Canadian Derby story, the first time that over $100,000 was wagered on the Derby race itself. In 1969, the classic type of long race, Wind d'Amour from the FMR stable of Fred Mannix of Calgary, raced along in 9th place during the early running, and then turning for home, wended his way through the large field of 12 horses to win going away in a thrilling finish. 1970, again, honors went out to the West Coast. Frank McMahon, one of the leading owners and breeders of thoroughbreds in North America, shipped Swinging Apache. In the Derby trial 1 week ahead of the Derby, Swinging Apache led all the way to win impressively. Some doubt existed up to the post time of the Derby whether the horse was able to perform to his absolute best. He certainly left no doubt, opening up at the gate, leading by 5 lengths and toying with his rivals right to the wire. Followers of Damon Runyon had their field day in 1971 at Northlands Park when Kim's Kid, everything from a chapter of one of his great novels, came to life. Kim's Kid, owned by Ernie Camry, a one-horse owner, a one-horse breeder, charged up to win, paying $58, the largest price ever recorded in a Canadian Derby, and in doing so defeated some of the greatest 3-year-olds of the year from both East and West. In 1972, another rarity, a horse who just toyed with his field. Winning Red, carrying the silks of Edmonton lawyer Andy Sim, lived up to his reputation as favorite in that year's Derby, led all the way, and won handily in the drive. The East, after many years of disappointments, finally made it to the winner's circle. Wingspan, representing Kinghaven Farms, one of the largest Ontario thoroughbred breeders, managed to hang on in the drive to defeat Edmonton's own favorite, Grandin Park. In 1974, Eastern Canada tried for 2 straight by shipping Norland, the top 3-year-old in Ontario of that year. At the end of the Derby, he finished a close third, but not good enough to beat Alberta's Progressive Hope, who won it, and Icy Child, who finished second. 1975 saw 2 benchmarks established in the Canadian Derby. First, the race was won by an odds-on favorite. Secondly, a favored entry ran first and second. These were Pampas Host and Royal Morn, both carrying the silks of Jimmy Shields of Calgary. They won to a popular, rousing cheer from over 15,000 fans in the grandstand at Northlands that day. 1976, a new province was added to the list of Derby-winning provinces. That was Quebec, when Jean-Louis Levesque shipped Laissez-Passer to the Derby, where he won easily. In 1977, another first occurred in the Canadian Derby, but certainly not the kind that management or horsemen would have hoped for. At the first turn of the race, an interference occurred. RJ's Diamond went on to win the race with Western Reason second. The judges reviewed the films, and in their judgment, RJ's Diamond had fouled Honey Speed, who finished third. He was disqualified. Western Reason moved up. Western Reason had run a super race. To finish second, was not involved in it, and was given the Derby honors for Bory Margolis of Edmonton. Rain was certainly not an unheard of event on a Derby day. Continuous rain was. This record was shattered in 1978 when a continuous downpour throughout the entire racing card occurred at Northlands. Canadian Bill, John Lashuk's big 3-year-old from Calgary, found the sloppy track to his liking, opened up a commanding lead, and just continued to widen over his rivals to win easily. Once again, Eastern Canada triumphed in the Canadian Derby when All for Victory, ridden by Lloyd Duffy, came from well back in a large field to win going away.
We have Country Romance on the inside is Canicula, trailing is Prince Harry going into the backstretch. And now the real racing begins. Is All for Victory with Lloyd Duffy up at the midway point of the backstretch. Takes a 1-length lead. In second it is Foul Supper by 3 lengths. In third is Victory Round by 3/4. Fourth on the outside is Easter's Memory. And fifth it is Mr. Capacity. It looks like a 2-horse race right at this point past the quarter pole, as Lloyd Duffy has All for Victory opening up now to a 3-length margin. Foul Supper is in second by a half dozen lengths. In third it is Victory Round. As we come into the home lane up to the 16th pole, All for Victory with Lloyd Duffy up, coming for the wire here in the 50th running of the Canadian Derby. And winning here by 4.5 lengths, it is All for Victory, followed by Foul Supper. Then it was a Victory Round, followed by Mr. Capacity with a fiddle.
A top field of 12 horses faced the starter in the 1980 Canadian Derby, including Alberta's champion Kai Alta, and Driving Home, fresh from his victory in the Queen's Plate at Toronto's Woodbine Racetrack. At the finish, Kai Alta gave his all, but couldn't keep up to Driving Home, who won by a clear margin.
Sparteris between horses. Dusty Old Farmer closing with a rush on the far outside, Driving Home. As they head down the backstretch to the far turn, Police Inspector along the inside, Driving Home on the far outside as they come around the turn. Now it's Driving Home with the lead as they come around the turn. Police Inspector is second, Dusty Old Farmer is third. As they swing around the turn, Driving Home is the leader as they come to the head of the stretch. Then Police Inspector is second as they come down the stretch toward the finish. Coming down the stretch, Driving Home has the lead as they come down the stretch. As they drive toward the finish, Driving Home. Then along the outside is Kai Alta as they come to the finish, Driving Home. Kai Alta on the inside. It's Dusty Old Farmer. Then fourth is Police Inspector.
1981 probably saw one of the greatest Canadian-bred horses of all time win the Canadian Derby, the Grey Frost King from Ontario, who before had been champion 2-year-old, up to the Derby had been champion 3-year-old. Came to Alberta and was odds-on favorite. Turning for home, Frost King had moved into the lead. However, Alberta's Rapido Dom charged up and actually passed Frost King as the field turned for home. Down the stretch, Lloyd Duffy worked on his mount and managed a neck victory at the wire. Frost King went on to win the Sovereign Award as Canada's top 3-year-old and represented our country in Japan in their famous Japan Cup.
With Samoa alongside the rail. Then Sassy Singer is third. Brent's Nicky is fourth. Rapido Dom moving up from the outside as they head down the backstretch. Now it's Frost King gaining the lead as they head down the backstretch. Samoa is second. Rapido Dom closing ground with a rush. Friendly Letters also moving up as they head to the far turn. As they head to the turn, Frost King has the lead on the outside. Samoa coming on again as they come around the turn. Rapido Dom on the outside. Coming around the turn, now it's Rapido Dom as they come around the turn. Frost King is next, then Friendly Letters closing ground as they swing around the turn. Spice Trader also there at the head of the stretch. Coming down the stretch, Rapido Dom on the outside, Frost King down on the inside. As they come down the stretch, nose to nose with Frost King on the inside, Rapido Dom, Friendly Letters closing ground. As they come to the finish, Frost King on the inside. Then it's Rapido Dom alongside, on the outside, Friendly Letters and the rest.
In 1982, a small 6-horse field faced the starter in the Canadian Derby. From Eastern Canada, Exclusive Canadian came from off the pace to win a handy victory. After the Derby, Exclusive Canadian went on to win both the Alberta and Manitoba Derbies, the first horse to sweep the Prairie Triple Crown.
Along the inside, Traveling Victor. Exclusive Canadian moves to the outside. Coming around the turn, Nana's Vanna on top now by 2 lengths as they swing around the turn. Traveling Victor down on the inside. Exclusive Canadian from the outside. At the head of the stretch and coming down the stretch. Nana's Vanna down on the inside. Then from the outside as they come down the stretch, Exclusive Canadian. Exclusive Canadian with the lead now. And as they come to the finish, it'll be Exclusive Canadian, Nana's Vanna. Then close finish for Show and the rest. If one could only look in a crystal ball and forecast what names will be placed on this Canadian Derby trophy in the years to come. I suppose when you reflect back over the 50-some-odd years that the Canadian Derby has been raced, if we went back to that very first day and you said to some of the horsemen at that point in time, that in 50 years' time, purse money for the Canadian Derby would be 50 times the original amount in some 50 years. They would likely shake their heads in disbelief and say, no way. But in 1982, purse money surpassed $100,000. The future, well, only time will tell us what will happen. But Morris Taylor has his ideas.
The Canadian Derby, from Sonoma through Brother Leo, up to Quick Quick, and horses like Chariot Chaser and Frost King, has really been one of the great races in Canada. It's become more than that, more than a great race. It's become an event on the social and sports calendars of Edmonton. The race has a great future. The purse will continue to rise. The acceptance of the race from Ontario, from Manitoba, BC, and Quebec continues strong. And I feel horses will come from all parts of the country to try to win the Canadian Derby because it is a jewel in any horse's crown.